Hey, this is Ben, and what we're going to do is take a look at the moral argument for God's existence. This is an argument that believers in God have used for thousands of years to defend the existence of God. It's up to each person to decide if they actually think this argument does the job of proving God exists or not. So the argument goes like this: right and wrong exists if and only if God exists. Right and wrong exists, therefore God exists. Now this is a logically valid argument, and what that means is that if 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion must be true. So right and wrong exists if and only if God exists. Right and wrong exists. Logically, therefore God exists. If and only if those first two are true. Well, not necessarily only if, but anyway, we'll get to it. So, how do people come back at this argument and say that it fails to prove God exists? Well, one of the main things people say is just because I don't believe in God, or just because a person doesn't believe in God, it doesn't mean that they can't be a good person. Well, that's actually exactly what the argument is saying. When you say that, you're just agreeing with the argument. The argument says right and wrong exists if and only if God exists, and then right and wrong exists. So for two to be true, you, whether you're atheist, Buddhist, Christian, whatever, you have to know that there is such a thing as right and wrong. Not that people behave good or bad, but that there is such a thing as a good or bad way in which to live, a good or evil way in which to be. And so the fact that atheists know that there's such a thing as right and wrong means that they're just agreeing with the second premise of this argument, that you and me and everyone knows that there's such a thing as right and wrong. So the first premise would be, well, how could it be that there is such a thing as right and wrong? So the next thing that you often hear is evolution can explain morality. That, we've evolved this way, and that animals who look after their young and have sort of a herd mentality and don't kill each other are more likely to survive. So we could have evolved this trait over time, and then the animals that didn't evolve that way, they died out because it's a trait that actually helps survival. It has survival value. It makes you more likely to pass on your genes. So it's just a byproduct of evolution. So my response to that is, let's see if I can say this right. Do we believe that murder, something as evil as murder, do we believe that it's wrong because we evolved that way? Because we evolved in such a way that we believe it's wrong because we evolved that way? Or did we evolve that way because it's wrong? Okay? So there's only two ways you can go with this. One is you could come back and say, well, we evolved that way because it's wrong. Well, if we evolved that way because it's wrong, then it's not really evolution that's making it wrong. It's something else that's making us evolve that way that's making us wrong. So there would be something above evolution that makes it wrong. It wouldn't really be grounded or coming from evolution. Or you could say, well, it's wrong because we evolved that way. Alright, so this is probably what most people who buy into the evolutionary explanation for morality, this is where they're at. We think that murder is wrong because we evolved to think it's wrong. Okay, now here's a syllogism for you, another argument for you. Living things either act by choice or according to programmed properties. Living things which act according to programmed properties do not have desires. They only function like a machine, like a mechanism. The way they're made is how they operate. Therefore, we cannot have desires unless we make choices. That seems fairly obvious. But let's try to imagine what someone would argue back and say. Well, they would say, okay. Living things can be programmed to desire to be good by giving them complicated goals. In other words, if we don't have desires, then we don't really believe in morality and good and evil. We just function like a robot. And we're not really, good or bad, or we don't think that I desire to be good, and I desire for good things to happen, and I desire for good things to happen to my family. If you're just functioning off how you've been made by programmed properties and you don't make choices, then you don't have desires. And so the skeptic can come back and say, okay, hold on. Evolution can program you to have desires. It's like, how can evolution program you to have desires if it can't? Because evolution can't let you make choices. I mean, if evolution is true, then I'm just a chemical reaction. You know, darling, I love you is really, darling, I'm having a chemical reaction right now. And evolution functions on naturalistic, physical, material processes. Atoms don't choose to react in your brain in a certain way. They just react based on their properties. Okay, so this is what they say. Well, what evolution can do is it can program you over millennium, program creatures to desire by giving you complicated goals. So in other words, you can believe survival is good, but you know, or you can just be programmed to survive. Maybe not believe survival is good, but then you will have to make value judgments based on milk is good for survival and drinking oil from in the ground is bad for survival. So you're making value judgments based on that program thing. You're programmed to survive. You don't really desire to survive, but you still have to make those value judgments, so evolution can introduce good and bad in that way. Okay, so this is the thing, and this is what I want you to think about. The GPS in your car. Okay, if you are just a machine that's functioning based on how you've been programmed to function, then let's say an obstacle impedes you from doing whatever you were programmed to do. Will you recalculate and move on, or will you care? In other words, like if you program the GPS in your car to take you to the big city in some little place and you make a mistake, the GPS doesn't really care. It just functions. It doesn't really care if you never get there. It just operates according to its programming. It doesn't really think it's good or bad that you got there. It just recalculates. Right? Now, let's say that the skeptic is still refusing to agree with me, and let's say the skeptic comes back, and the skeptic says, all right. There's no difference between, you know, all this recalculating and actually caring. So the recalculating is just saying, it's just a fancy way of saying, you know, that didn't achieve my objective, so bad. And recalculate. I think hopefully you're able to see that, like, actually there is a difference, but to highlight it even more, let's just pretend the skeptic just is hard-headed, and let's just come back. All right, so what would I say to the skeptic at that point? Will the machine ever conclude that it intentionally did something it fully knew to be evil? No. And that should be blatantly obvious at this point. If we are such machines, then how do we even have an idea of good and evil? The fact that we have the idea of good and evil means that we're not such machines. End of story. Okay, so most people, you know, especially teenagers, I give them the moral argument for God's existence, and what they don't go this evolution route. That you tend to have to go to college to come up with that. But what they say is, okay. All right. We have the ability to make choices. They're not going to rule out, you know, we're not programmed machines, we're not robots, because we wouldn't be moral or good or evil, we just function. Okay, but we have the ability to make choices, but people make morality. Societies make morality. This society over here, the Nazis thought it was okay to kill off the elderly for being old. In ancient Greece, they thought it was wrong for disabled children to be allowed to live. And in fact, our word monster comes from that, and they thought that, like, the abode of the dead was filled with monsters because it was all the kids they had died who were obviously deformed and cursed because they came out deformed from the womb and they were going to grow up to be a monster. And we think that's horrible, that you would be killing kids for having deformities. So this is where people come from, and they say, all right, yeah, you know, man makes morality. So here's my question. All right, if man makes morality, if good and evil is whatever people make it, then which man makes it? Hitler, this is Ravi Zacharias' three that he likes to use. Hitler, Hugh Hefner, or Gandhi. Who are you going to have make morality? Because every one of them would make a completely different morality. A completely different set idea of what's good and evil. Now that probably wouldn't faze the skeptic too much, right? Because they would say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's what they would say, right? Because morality is subjective. It's not objective. This is what people say. You know, there's no objective morality. There's no absolute standard. It's subjective to whatever people, you know, decide. To the society that you're in and to how the people come to it. Alright, so let's say you get up in the morning. Are you going to try to survive or are you going to try to die? Big difference. Survive, you might want to eat breakfast, you know, take a bath, go to work so you can pay the bills. If you want to die, well, you wouldn't necessarily want to do any of those things. You might just get in the car and drive into oncoming traffic. Big difference. You wouldn't need to take a bath. Who cares how good you smell, because you're going to smell really bad when you're dead, right? Okay, so do you try to survive or die? And, you know, as Socrates, he was kind of sarcastic when they were executing him, but he said, how do y'all know that I'm not going to something better? But that's a good question. Like, which is best? Is it better to die? Or is it better to stay alive? If there is no such thing as right and wrong, then who's to say that it's wrong to die and that it's good to survive? No one to say. That's what you're saying when you say morality is subjective. Okay? If neither is best, then how is it even possible to make a choice ever? And how does a culture or a society ever decide which moral system to choose when all of them are totally equal? There's no reason, no legitimate reason to think one of them is better than the other. According to what someone who says that morality is subjective, then no moral system is better than any other moral system. Oh no, what are we going to do? Okay, so how do you even decide then? How do you pick? It's like saying Rottweilers are dogs and Chihuahuas are dogs, therefore I'm going to get a Rottweiler. Well, how does the fact that they're both dogs tell you, how does that play into how you would decide? That's not a relevant difference. And there would be no relevant difference between any moral system if it's totally subjective to whatever people want to make up. Okay, so here's the syllogism at this point. Evolution cannot create morality. We've debunked that. It is impossible to make a choice unless one believes it to be better than the alternative choice. I mean, when you make a choice, it is implicit in making a choice that you chose that choice over the other choice. It is impossible to make a choice without thinking that making the choice is better than not making it. Alright. Therefore, humans cannot exist without a knowledge that some choices are better than others. I mean, you can't exist, you can't live, you can't be unless you have knowledge, actual real knowledge that some choices are better than others. Because if you didn't have that knowledge, then there would be no being, that you couldn't make choices. Okay. Now, therefore, there has to be knowledge from some moral lawgiver, God, because obviously evolution can't create it. It has to come from some being that makes choices, and there has to be an absolute moral lawgiver. We just can't create the laws just willy-nilly. This person over here makes his, and that person over there makes theirs. There has to be knowledge of objective morality. Otherwise, we can't exist as people making choices. Life would be completely unlivable. Do you take a bath or do you put a gun to your head? There's no way to choose. Okay, now the skeptic might come back from that. Let's just say the skeptic's not going down easy. And the skeptic says, humans can make assumptions without knowledge. That, you know, they could just assume that some things are good and some things are bad. And just make an assumption. Okay? Roll the dice. Be arbitrary. Draw straws. Okay? Hopefully, if you're wise to where we're going, you're going to see that's still a problem, because that's still a choice. You're still making a choice to make the assumption, to roll the dice. Which means you can't make that choice to be arbitrary, to make assumptions, unless you believe that it was good to make the assumption. And it's still a choice you're making, and you still make it because you think it's superior to the alternative. Okay? Humans must be able to make choices based on real knowledge of good and evil. Otherwise, they can't exist. They would have to cease making choices altogether. Now, humans do often make mistakes about what we think is right and what we think is wrong. We've all done that. We've all done things that we thought, you know what, I guess that wasn't as the right thing to do, but at the time I thought it was. We all make those mistakes. But here's the point. We still continue. That in the face of the fact that we've made a mistake, we still, this is a common factor of life. Life goes on. Even if you messed up, you still try to make corrections and get it right from now on. Fascinating, isn't it? So, like, the fact that people continue to live proves that they have some sense, some moral sense of what's right and what's wrong. In other words, good and evil. Even if it is a cloudy sense, think of it like, you can see things clearly when they're right in front of your face, but if they're really far off, there's something out there, but you might make some goofs in figuring out what it is. And the moral sense can be like that. In some situations, it's like, don't kill a baby, that's bad. But in other situations, in the long distance, was this the right thing to do? Should we get rid of all nuclear weapons? Because what if nuclear war breaks out, but then maybe nuclear technology has decreased, the threat of war by making war so scary, and that's a little more cloudy. But here's the point. The fact that people make mistakes and continue to go on, they could not continue to go on in the light of the mistakes that they have made unless they have some sort of at least cloudy knowledge. It would be impossible. As soon as the first person made a mistake about what they thought was right, there would be the end of making choices. Alright? Because you can't make choices without believing that it was better than the alternative. That's impossible. That's a logical absurdity. That's like saying that, I'm married and a bachelor. You can't be, you would have people, if so you came up to someone and said, I hear you and your wife are having a baby, and she says yes and he says no, you're not going to think that you got your question answered. You're going to think that they mean it in some funny way, but not that in the literal yes sense, in the literal no sense, or that someone's literally married in the normal sense and literally a bachelor in the normal sense. No, that's meaningless gibberish. That's like saying that everything I did is someone else's fault, but I don't blame them for it. That's meaningless gibberish, okay? So you cannot make choices without believing that the choice is better than the alternative, and so therefore all life would stop as soon as the first person made a mistake about what they thought was the right thing to do, except for the fact that they must have some sort of understanding, albeit a cloudy understanding, of what's right and what's wrong. And so the skeptic might come back, still at this point, and say, well, the moral sense can still be mistaken. That is exactly what we're saying, right? Humans often make mistakes regarding what is right and what is wrong. Such doubts would end all human choice unless there is access to some knowledge. Therefore, all people must have some true knowledge of good and evil, or else they cannot exist at all. Therefore, an ultimate moral lawgiver of objective laws of good and evil must exist, even if the exact nature of those laws and that moral lawgiver must also be cloudy. Therefore, there exists a perfectly good being who is the foundation of what it means to be good. In other words, there has to be a God. There's still room for moral progress because it's still cloudy. To say that we can't learn more about good and evil would be like saying that we can't learn more about God. Of course we can learn more about God, because if we couldn't learn anything more about God, then we would be God, and that we're obviously not God. Do you know everything? Do you do everything right? No, then you're not God. You have some room for improvement, obviously. So, therefore, there's always room for moral progress, even in societies, even in culture. I bet the people 1,000 years from now will look back at us, and hopefully they'll say, wow, those people were barbarians. Just like we look at the people 1,000 years ago and we say, whoa, or 2,000 years ago. Or like in ancient Sparta 2,500 years ago, and we're like, or Greece I was telling you about. It wasn't just the Spartans who killed babies, it was all the Greeks. They had different ranges. Some were more lenient. The Spartans were the most strict, but yeah, we look at that as barbaric. They didn't see themselves as barbaric. What are people in the future going to look at us like? You know what I mean? And so the bottom line is, if there is a God, then morality is this ever elusive thing. And if you believe that man makes morality, then I guess you're already perfect, and there's no room for you to improve. Okay, so I hope this video made some sense. Thank you for your time.